Sometimes the moment you think your life is over is exactly when it begins. The church bells rang softly through the tall windows of St. Matthew's Chapel, their echoes drifting across polished wooden pews filled with whispering guests dressed in pastel suits and spring dresses. Sunlight poured through the stained glass, scattering colors across the marble aisle where Emily Carter stood frozen in the center of it all, her white wedding gown pooling around her feet like a quiet ocean. 100 pairs of eyes watched her, some with sympathy, some with curiosity, a few with poorly hidden judgment. The air smelled faintly of lilies and candle wax, and the large clock above the chapel doors ticked with cruel precision. 3:14 p.m. The ceremony had been scheduled for 3 o'clock sharp. The minister checked his watch again, then glanced gently toward Emily. "We can wait a few more minutes," he said softly, though everyone in the room could hear the doubt beneath his calm voice. Emily forced a polite smile, but her hands trembled around the small bouquet of ivory roses she had been holding for nearly 20 minutes. Her phone vibrated quietly in the delicate clutch hidden beneath the folds of her dress. For a second, hope flickered in her chest. Maybe Jason was stuck in traffic. Maybe his car had broken down. Maybe he was running late and would burst through the chapel doors any second with that sheepish smile she had fallen in love with 2 years ago. Emily slipped the phone out and glanced down at the screen. One message. From Jason Miller. Her fiancé. Her groom. Her future. Or at least the future she thought she had. The message was only 6 words long. "I'm sorry. I can't do this." Emily stared at the screen as if the words might rearrange themselves into something kinder. They didn't. The murmurs in the chapel began to swell like distant waves. A woman near the back whispered something to her husband. Someone else quietly pulled out their phone. Another guest shifted awkwardly in their seat. Emily's chest felt tight, like the air had suddenly grown too thin to breathe. She lifted her head slowly toward the large chapel doors, still half expecting Jason to appear and say it was all a mistake. But the doors remained closed. Still, silent, empty. The realization crept in quietly but firmly. Jason wasn't coming. Her perfect wedding day had just become the worst day of her life. Emily swallowed hard and forced her legs to move, turning slightly toward the minister as if to say something, anything, to end the unbearable silence. But before she could speak, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the chapel suddenly opened with a deep echo that rolled through the room. Every head turned at once. A tall man stepped inside, dressed in a tailored black suit that caught the afternoon light as he paused beneath the archway. He wasn't Jason. Emily knew that instantly. This man carried himself differently, calm, deliberate, composed in a way that made the entire room seem to quiet around him. His dark hair was neatly combed, his posture straight, his expression unreadable as his gaze settled directly on Emily, standing alone at the altar. A soft ripple of confusion moved through the guests. The stranger walked slowly down the aisle, each step steady against the marble floor, until he stopped several feet from the altar. Up close, Emily could see the quiet intensity in his gray eyes. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the man took a calm breath and said something that made the entire chapel fall completely silent. "If the groom isn't coming, I would like to take his place." The words seemed to hang in the air like a sudden change in gravity. For a moment nobody moved, nobody spoke, and even the quiet ticking of the chapel clock seemed to fade into the background. Emily blinked slowly, certain she had misunderstood what she had just heard. The tall stranger stood calmly at the end of the aisle, his expression steady, as if what he had said made perfect sense. A few guests shifted in their seats. Someone near the front whispered, "Who is that?" The minister cleared his throat awkwardly and looked between the two of them. Emily felt heat rise to her cheeks, a mixture of embarrassment, disbelief, and something else she could not quite name. She tightened her grip around the small bouquet in her hands. "I am sorry," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. "Do you know me?" The man's lips curved into the faintest hint of a polite smile, not arrogant, not mocking, simply calm. "No," he said honestly, "but I know the man who was supposed to be standing here." The room stirred again with curiosity. Emily stared at him, confusion replacing some of the shock that had been freezing her in place. "You know Jason?" The man nodded once. "My name is Dr. Alexander Hayes." The name alone caused several guests to react immediately. A woman near the middle row gasped softly. Another man leaned toward his wife and whispered something that made her eyes widen. Emily did not immediately recognize the name, but the sudden ripple through the room told her that she probably should have. Alexander continued walking forward slowly until he stood only a few feet from the altar. Up close, his presence was strangely grounding, like a steady anchor in the chaos of the moment. Jason Miller works at one of my hospitals, he explained calmly. Or rather, he worked there until this morning. Emily's brow furrowed. I do not understand. Alexander reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a thin envelope. He did not open it, only held it loosely in his hand. Jason left the city about 40 minutes ago, he said gently. He withdrew a large amount of money from an account that does not belong to him. He also resigned from his position by email shortly before your ceremony began. A wave of murmurs spread across the chapel. Emily felt the floor beneath her heels suddenly feel unsteady. That cannot be right, she whispered. Jason would not do that. Alexander's voice remained calm, almost careful, as though he understood how fragile the moment already was. Miss Carter, I wish I were wrong. Unfortunately, my legal team confirmed it less than an hour ago. Emily lowered her eyes to the marble floor, trying to process the words. The man she had planned to spend her life with had not only abandoned her, but had also vanished entirely. The humiliation she had felt moments ago began to mix with a deeper ache of betrayal. Alexander studied her expression quietly before speaking again, his voice softer this time. I realize this is an impossible situation. Emily looked up at him again, still struggling to keep her composure in front of an entire chapel filled with guests. Then why would you say something like that? She asked. Why would you offer to marry a stranger? For the first time, Alexander hesitated for a brief second, as if weighing his answer carefully. Then he said, because surprisingly enough, Miss Carter, marrying you might solve both of our problems today. The chapel fell silent once more. Emily stared at Alexander Hayes as his words settled over the silent chapel like a ripple across still water. Marrying you might solve both of our problems today. The sentence sounded so calm coming from him that for a moment she wondered if the entire situation had somehow become unreal. Guests shifted in their seats again, their quiet whispers bouncing off the tall stone walls of St. Matthew's Chapel. Emily could feel every pair of eyes watching her, waiting to see what she would do next. Her heart was still racing from the shock of Jason's message, and now this stranger, this billionaire doctor everyone seemed to recognize except her, was standing in front of the altar offering something that sounded completely impossible. She lowered her bouquet slightly, studying Alexander's face as if searching for a sign that this was some strange joke. His expression remained steady and serious. You cannot possibly be serious, she said quietly. Alexander's tone did not change. I am completely serious. Emily shook her head slowly. You do not even know me. That is true, Alexander admitted. But I know enough about today to understand that you have just been placed in a situation no one deserves. The minister stood awkwardly to the side of the altar, unsure whether he should step in or remain silent. A few guests leaned forward, clearly listening to every word. Emily felt her face grow warm again, but this time the embarrassment was mixed with confusion and curiosity. You said this would solve your problem too, she said cautiously. What problem could possibly be solved by marrying a stranger in the middle of someone else's wedding ceremony? Alexander glanced briefly toward the chapel doors as if organizing his thoughts before answering. Then he spoke in the same calm, measured voice. My father founded Hayes Medical Group nearly 40 years ago. It is now one of the largest private hospital networks in the country. Emily had heard the name before somewhere, but the details were still blurry in her mind. Alexander continued. 3 months ago my father suffered a serious stroke. He survived, but he is no longer able to run the company. A quiet murmur passed through the guests again. Alexander ignored it. His will includes a very specific condition, he explained. If I am not married before my 35th birthday, control of the company transfers to a board of trustees chosen by distant relatives who have never practiced medicine in their lives. Emily blinked, trying to absorb the information. And your birthday is soon. Tomorrow, Alexander said. The words seemed to land between them with quiet finality. Emily let out a slow breath. So you came to a stranger's wedding hoping to find a wife? For the first time, a faint hint of humor touched Alexander's expression. No. I came here because I was investigating Jason Miller's disappearance from the hospital. I did not expect to walk into this situation. Emily glanced around the chapel again, suddenly aware of the hundreds of witnesses surrounding them. The flowers, the decorations, the music still waiting to begin. Everything prepared for a wedding that had just collapsed minutes earlier. Alexander spoke again, softer now. Miss Carter, I understand how absurd this must sound. But if we walk out of here today, both of our lives will become far more complicated than they already are. Emily met his eyes again. And if we do not walk out? Alexander's answer was simple. Then we walk out married. Emily felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders as the quiet words left Alexander's mouth. Then we walk out married. The chapel was so silent now that she could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents high above the stained glass windows. Just minutes ago, she had been preparing to begin a life she thought she understood. Now everything had shifted so suddenly that her thoughts struggled to keep up. She looked down at the bouquet still in her hands. The ivory roses had been chosen months ago after hours of planning and excitement. They were supposed to represent a beginning built on certainty. Instead, they now felt like props in a scene she could never have imagined. Emily slowly lifted her eyes back to Alexander. You are asking me to make a life-changing decision in the middle of the most humiliating moment of my life, she said quietly. Alexander did not look away. I know, he replied. And I would not ask if there were another reasonable option. Emily studied his face carefully. He did not appear desperate or manipulative. If anything, he seemed almost calm, as if he were presenting a solution to a complicated problem rather than proposing something as serious as marriage. That calmness made the situation feel even more surreal. She glanced around the chapel again. Her relatives, her co-workers from the small preschool where she taught, and Jason's family were all watching with stunned expressions. A few of Jason's friends looked uncomfortable, avoiding her gaze. The whispers had returned, spreading like quiet waves across the pews. Emily took a slow breath. Let us say for a moment that I believed you, she said. What exactly would this marriage mean? Alexander answered without hesitation. It would be a legal marriage. Public, official, and recognized by the board of my company. Emily frowned slightly. And after that we would live our separate lives privately while maintaining the appearance of a normal marriage in public settings. His tone remained calm, almost professional. It would last 1 year. After that we could quietly file for divorce with no complications. The directness of his explanation made several guests gasp softly again. Emily blinked. You have thought this through. Alexander gave a small nod. I have had a long day. Emily almost laughed, though the sound caught in her throat before it could fully escape. She looked at the chapel doors again, half expecting Jason to walk back inside, and in the madness of the moment. But the doors remained closed. Still. Final. Alexander spoke again, his voice gentler now. Miss Carter, I realize you owe me nothing. But if you agree to this arrangement, I will make sure your future becomes far more stable than it was 5 minutes ago. Emily tilted her head slightly. What does that mean? Alexander answered plainly. Your student loans will be paid in full. I will also fund the early childhood education center you mentioned in your wedding website interview. Emily stared at him in shock. You read that? Yes. Emily felt the world tilt again, but this time not from humiliation. From possibility. The idea of opening her own learning center had been a dream she had quietly carried for years, something she had never believed she could afford. She looked down at the bouquet again, then back at the man standing calmly in front of her. Dr. Hayes, she said slowly, are you seriously asking me to walk back down this aisle and marry you instead? Alexander met her eyes steadily. Yes, he said. I am. Emily stood perfectly still at the altar as Alexander's words echoed quietly in her mind. Yes, I am. The chapel remained suspended in a strange silence, the kind that comes when dozens of people are waiting for a moment that could change everything. She could feel the weight of their attention pressing against her back, their curiosity filling the room like invisible smoke. Just 30 minutes earlier, she had believed she was about to marry the man she had trusted with her future. Now that future had collapsed and a completely different path was standing directly in front of her. Emily took a slow breath and tried to steady the rush of thoughts racing through her mind. Her eyes drifted toward the chapel doors once more. Jason was not coming back. That truth had settled into the room like a final chapter already written. She looked down at the marble floor beneath her shoes, remembering the months she had spent planning this day, the invitations, the dress fittings, the careful budget she had stretched as far as possible. All of it had been built around a promise that had disappeared with a 6-word message on her phone. Emily slowly lifted her head again and met Alexander's gaze. Unlike the chaos inside her thoughts, his expression remained steady and patient, as though he understood that this decision could not be rushed. "You realize this sounds completely unbelievable," she said quietly. Alexander gave a small nod. "I do." Emily tilted her head slightly. "A stranger offers to solve my financial problems and help me build my dream school in exchange for a marriage that lasts exactly 1 year." Alexander answered calmly. "A legal partnership that benefits both of us. Nothing more complicated than that." Emily studied him carefully. There was no arrogance in his voice, no hint that he believed she should automatically say yes. If anything, he looked almost respectful, like someone presenting an opportunity and waiting to see if the other person would take it. She thought about the life she had been living. A small apartment above a bakery. Long days teaching preschool students whose families sometimes struggled as much as she did. Student loan payments that followed her every month like a shadow she could never quite outrun. She had always believed that hard work alone would eventually open the door she dreamed about. But standing here now, she realized how long that road could be. Emily glanced again at the rows of guests filling the chapel. Some looked sympathetic. Others simply looked fascinated. But none of them were the person who had promised to stand beside her today. Alexander spoke again, quietly enough that only she could hear clearly. "Miss Carter, if you say no, I will respect that completely. I will walk out of this chapel and never trouble you again." His words were simple and direct. "But if you say yes, we both leave this room with our futures still intact." Emily felt her heart beating faster again. But this time it was not from humiliation. It was from the realization that life sometimes changes direction without warning. She looked down at the bouquet of ivory roses one more time. Then she lifted her eyes to Alexander Hayes and asked the question that would decide everything. "If we do this," she said slowly, "we do it honestly. No lies between us. No pretending to be something we are not when we are alone." Alexander nodded immediately. "Agreed." Emily took one final breath and turned slightly toward the minister who had been waiting in stunned silence beside them. When she spoke, her voice was steady enough for the entire chapel to hear. "Reverend," she said, "it appears the ceremony will be continuing after all." The minister blinked twice as if he needed a moment to understand what he had just heard. The entire chapel seemed to hold its breath. Emily Carter had just agreed to continue a wedding ceremony with a man she had met less than 10 minutes earlier. Alexander Hayes stood beside her, calm and composed, as though this unexpected turn of events had already been accounted for in his mind. The guests looked between them in stunned silence, unsure whether they were witnessing the most unbelievable mistake or the beginning of something extraordinary. The minister cleared his throat slowly and glanced at Alexander. "Dr. Hayes," he said carefully, "marriage is a serious commitment. I must be certain that both of you understand what you are agreeing to today." Alexander answered without hesitation. "We understand." The minister then turned to Emily. "And you, Miss Carter?" Emily felt 100 emotions moving through her at once. Shock, uncertainty, curiosity, but beneath all of it there was a surprising sense of calm that had begun to settle in her chest. 5 minutes earlier her future had vanished in front of everyone she knew. Now a different path had appeared, strange and unexpected, but still a path forward. She lifted her chin slightly and nodded. "Yes," she said clearly. "I understand." A quiet wave of whispers moved across the pews again as the minister slowly opened the small book in his hands. The ceremony resumed, though it now carried an entirely different energy than the one planned earlier that day. Emily felt Alexander step slightly closer beside her as the minister spoke about partnership, trust, and the responsibility two people share when they choose to build a life together. The words felt almost surreal considering how suddenly this moment had arrived. Yet Alexander remained completely attentive, his posture straight, his expression focused as though he took every word seriously despite the unusual circumstances. When the time came for the vows, the minister paused and looked between them. "Dr. Hayes," he said gently, Do you take Emily Carter to be your wife? Alexander's answer came steady and clear. I do. The simplicity of his voice carried through the quiet chapel. Emily felt the sound settle somewhere deep in her chest. The minister then turned to her. Miss Carter, do you take Alexander Hayes to be your husband? Emily hesitated for only a fraction of a second. She thought about the life she had imagined this morning. She thought about the message on her phone that had shattered it. And then she looked at the man standing beside her who had stepped forward when no one else had. She took a slow breath. I do. The minister gave a small, astonished smile before continuing. A ring box appeared from the inside pocket of Alexander's suit jacket. The simple platinum band inside caught the light from the stained glass windows above. Emily realized with quiet amazement that he had somehow anticipated this moment. Alexander gently took her hand. His touch was steady, respectful, careful not to startle her. Emily Carter, he said quietly as he placed the ring on her finger, I promise to honor this agreement and treat you with honesty and respect. The words were simple, but there was sincerity in them that surprised her. Emily repeated her own vow just as simply. Moments later, the minister closed his book and looked out at the stunned guests filling the chapel. By the authority granted to me by the state, he announced slowly, still sounding slightly amazed himself, I now pronounce you husband and wife. The chapel erupted into a mixture of shocked laughter, applause, and disbelief. Emily stood there for a moment, staring at the ring now resting on her hand. In less than 15 minutes, she had gone from being abandoned at the altar to becoming Mrs. Emily Hayes. The sound of applause slowly faded as the guests inside St. Matthew's Chapel tried to process what they had just witnessed. A wedding that had begun with confusion and heartbreak had somehow ended with an entirely different couple standing at the altar. Emily remained still for a moment, her mind struggling to catch up with the reality that had unfolded in less than half an hour. The platinum ring resting on her finger felt both unfamiliar and strangely heavy, as though it carried the weight of a decision she had made, without fully understanding where it might lead. Alexander stood beside her with the same calm presence he had maintained since the moment he walked through the chapel doors. He turned slightly toward her and spoke quietly enough that only she could hear. We should greet the guests, he said gently. Emily nodded slowly. The idea that these people were now technically celebrating her marriage to a man she had met only minutes earlier was almost too surreal to comprehend. Yet as she stepped down from the altar beside Alexander, the room began to fill with cautious congratulations. Some guests approached carefully, offering polite smiles and curious glances, unsure how to react to the most unexpected wedding they had ever attended. Emily recognized several of her co-workers from the preschool where she taught. Their expressions were a mixture of concern and amazement. One of them squeezed her hand softly and whispered, Are you okay? Emily gave a small smile and nodded. In truth, she was still trying to understand her own feelings. Across the room, Jason's parents quietly gathered their belongings and slipped out through the chapel doors without saying a word. Their departure felt like the final closing of a chapter that had ended far more abruptly than anyone expected. Alexander remained attentive beside Emily, answering a few brief questions from curious guests with polite restraint. He never spoke too much, but there was something reassuring about the steady way he handled the attention. After several minutes, the chapel slowly began to empty as people drifted outside into the warm afternoon sunlight, still talking about what they had just witnessed. When the last of the guests had finally stepped outside, the large chapel felt suddenly quiet again. Emily stood near the front pews and looked down at the ring once more. I suppose this means we should talk about what happens next, she said softly. Alexander gave a small nod. Yes, that would be wise. Emily folded her hands together, the bouquet now resting on the nearby bench. For example, she said carefully, where exactly does your new wife live? Alexander's expression softened slightly, almost amused by the practicality of her question. My home is in Manhattan, he explained. A penthouse apartment near Central Park. It will be easier for us to maintain the appearance of a normal marriage if we share the same residence. Emily raised her eyebrows slightly. That sounds very different from my one-bedroom apartment above a bakery in Queens. Alexander nodded thoughtfully. Then perhaps this arrangement will be an adjustment for both of us. Emily allowed herself a small laugh for the first time that day. The sound felt strange but welcome after the emotional storm of the afternoon. Alexander glanced toward the chapel doors where sunlight spilled across the marble floor. "My car is waiting outside," he said calmly. Emily took one last look around the chapel where her life had unexpectedly changed direction. Then she turned toward the doors beside the man who was now, officially and legally, her husband. The warm afternoon sunlight outside St. Matthew's Chapel felt almost unreal after the storm of emotions that had unfolded inside. Emily stepped through the tall wooden doors beside Alexander and paused at the top of the wide stone steps, blinking slightly as the bright light washed over the quiet church courtyard. A black sedan waited at the curb, polished so perfectly that it reflected the sky like a mirror. The driver stood beside the open rear door, his posture professional and composed as though unexpected weddings were simply part of his normal schedule. Emily looked down at the ring on her finger again, still half expecting that she might wake up and discover the entire day had been some strange dream. Instead, she was standing beside a billionaire surgeon who had become her husband less than 20 minutes earlier. Alexander noticed her quiet hesitation and spoke in the same calm tone he had used since the beginning of the afternoon. "Take your time," he said gently. "I realize this is a lot to absorb in a single day." Emily let out a slow breath and gave a small smile. That might be the understatement of the year. She carefully gathered the skirt of her wedding dress as they walked down the steps together. The driver opened the car door and nodded respectfully. "Good afternoon, Dr. Hayes." Alexander returned the greeting with a small nod before turning slightly toward Emily. "Mrs. Hayes," he said quietly, as if testing the new name. Emily raised her eyebrows at the sound of it, but could not help smiling faintly. That is still going to take some getting used to. Once they were seated inside the car, the driver closed the door and the vehicle began moving smoothly through the quiet streets surrounding the church. Emily watched the familiar neighborhood pass by the window, realizing how quickly the world outside continued moving even when someone's entire life had just changed direction. After a few moments, she turned toward Alexander, who was sitting beside her with the same thoughtful composure he always seemed to carry. "All right," she said. "If we are really going to do this for a year, there are a few things we should probably clarify." Alexander nodded. "I agree." Emily lifted one hand and gently counted off her questions on her fingers. "First, we should probably decide how two people who met today are supposed to explain their marriage to the world." Alexander considered the question for a moment. "The truth might be more effective than a complicated story," he replied. "We met unexpectedly and chose to get married. The details do not need to be shared publicly." Emily tilted her head thoughtfully. That might actually work. She paused before asking her next question. "Second, I want to make sure the school we talked about is not just a generous promise made in a dramatic moment." Alexander's expression softened slightly. "It was never a dramatic promise," he said. "It was a serious commitment." Emily studied him for a moment before nodding slowly. "Then I suppose I should start thinking about what that school will look like." Alexander looked out the window briefly as the car turned onto a larger avenue lined with tall buildings. "There is one more thing you should know," he said calmly. Emily glanced at him. "What is that?" Alexander answered with the same quiet honesty he had shown since the beginning. "My life is about to become very public tomorrow. The board of Hayes Medical Group will announce my marriage at the annual leadership meeting." Emily blinked. "How many people attend that meeting?" Alexander gave a small, thoughtful pause before replying. "Approximately 300 executives, investors, and members of the press." Emily stared at him in disbelief for a second before laughing softly. "So the world will know about this marriage before I even unpack my suitcase." Alexander allowed the faintest smile to appear. "Yes," he said calmly. "Something like that." The black sedan glided through the busy streets of Manhattan as the late afternoon sun reflected off the glass towers surrounding Central Park. Emily sat quietly beside Alexander, watching the city move past the window while the reality of the past few hours continued to settle into her mind. Only that morning she had believed her future was simple and predictable. Now she was married to a man whose life seemed to exist on an entirely different scale from anything she had known. The car eventually turned onto a quiet tree-lined street, where an elegant residential tower rose high above the surrounding buildings. The vehicle slowed smoothly before pulling into a private entrance beneath a polished stone archway. A uniformed doorman stepped forward immediately, greeting Alexander with a respectful nod before opening the car door. Emily stepped out carefully, gathering the skirt of her wedding dress once again as she looked up at the building. The entrance alone looked larger than the entire apartment building where she had been living. Alexander noticed the expression on her face and spoke with quiet reassurance. "It will feel less intimidating once you have had a little time to adjust." Emily gave a small smile. "I am sure it will." They entered the lobby together, where soft lighting reflected off marble floors and tall windows framed the evening sky. The space was calm and elegant, almost like the entrance to a luxury hotel. A private elevator opened silently at the far end of the lobby, and Alexander led the way inside. As the doors closed, the elevator began rising smoothly toward the upper floors. Emily felt a strange mix of anticipation and disbelief. Just hours ago, she had been standing in a chapel wondering how she would recover from being abandoned at the altar. Now she was riding an elevator to a penthouse with the man who had stepped forward when her life seemed to fall apart. The elevator doors opened onto a quiet hallway that led directly into a spacious living area filled with warm evening light. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the sweeping skyline of New York City stretching for miles in every direction. Emily stepped forward slowly, taking in the view with quiet amazement. "This is incredible," she whispered. Alexander set his jacket aside and looked toward the city as well. "It is peaceful at night," he said. Emily turned back toward him after a moment. The day had been chaotic, confusing, and completely unexpected, yet standing there she felt a calm determination beginning to grow inside her. She looked down briefly at the ring on her finger before meeting Alexander's eyes again. "I know this marriage started as an agreement," she said thoughtfully. "But if we are going to spend the next year building this life together, I want to do it in a way that actually means something." Alexander listened carefully, his expression thoughtful. "What do you have in mind?" Emily walked closer to the window, looking out at the endless city lights beginning to glow as evening settled over Manhattan. "The school," she said quietly. "Not just a building. A place that gives children opportunities they might not otherwise have." Alexander stepped beside her, studying the skyline for a moment before nodding slowly. "Then, that is exactly what we will build." Emily felt a small sense of hope rise inside her. The future she had imagined that morning was gone, but perhaps something even more meaningful could grow from the unexpected path she had chosen. She looked once more at the city stretching endlessly beyond the windows and realized that sometimes life does not fall apart when plans fail. Sometimes it simply begins again in a completely different way.